David Lynch's Dune ends with rain. Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach, commands there to be rain, and the heavens obey.
And how can this be? For he is the Kwisatz Haderach.
It's meant to be a triumphant moment. But the rain on Dune is not joyous. Not really. Because this moment, the final act in Lynch's 1984 epic, neatly sums up the reason that it fails. Let's look at what made Dune so special in the first place, the ideas that gave it its appeal and identity, and then see how those ideas were translated, or indeed mistranslated, to the film. What is Dune? Why is the film like that? What's the book even about? Is Dune really unfilmable? Is Ray William Johnson doing your mom? Let's find out. Let's fucking go. Rain on Dune. Part 1. Ideas of Dune. Dune. Sorry, Dune. Dune's a weird book. Not only did it pioneer modern science fiction, it also became a huge influence in places outside of its genre. The Matrix, Game of Thrones, the album, if you're reading this, It's Too Late by Drake, don't even gotta explain that one. Frank Herbert, the author, was a former investigative journalist and a US Senator's scriptwriter. From this experience, he knew how power worked and how power is perceived. But although Dune is infamous for having many complicated factions and politicking, its real interest is in ideas. Dune actually reads a lot of the time like a fantasy novel. There's magical witches and ancient peoples with mythic prophecies about great heroes. But it is not a fantasy, and the main distinction twixt the two is this. A fantasy is a story in a different universe, and a sci-fi is in our own. Lord of the Rings, right, okay, Lord of the Rings. Middle-earth is not, in fact, Earth.
It's not even New Zealand!
It can't really be any planet in our galaxy or universe. More importantly, the characters don't act like humans in our universe. There's not a lot of moral ambiguity. There's binary good and binary bad, and if the good guys win, then that's good. Good. A sci-fi occurs in our universe. Dune itself happens in our universe, and the humans in Dune are us, 20,000 years or so later. So it has to appeal to our logic and our cynicism. Take Spice, for example, right? While Spice acts in an unbelievable way, the people around Spice act in a human way. The story accurately portrays what we would do to this valuable space resource because it just copies what we already do to valuable Earth resources. The powers that be hoard, they exert violent control, they try to make sure no one else can touch it. That's what sci-fi is so good at, portraying what real humans would do in the face of huge changes. And Dune is focused on one change in particular. Environmental change. Get your fucking cotton tote bags out for this one. The core of Dune all focuses on this central point. An environment shapes its people, and people shape their environment. All of the complexities fall into line to translate this single idea to the reader. Things in Dune don't happen just because. Any event in Dune has many reasons behind it, just as any big event in our world has many reasons behind them. Nothing is stagnant. Things are ever flowing and changing, even if we only get a snapshot of this complexity in the first book. Look at the Fremen, okay? The Fremen are the way they are from their environment. The water scarcity on Dune, the Harkonnens pillaging their lands. Any people that could survive these environments would have to be tough, smart, and enduring. And that's what the Fremen are. They're not that way just because. And they are aware of the way their environment shapes them, and are deadly proud of that fact.
We Fremen have a saying. God created Arrakis to train the faithful.
They're not like elves, for instance. Elves just are the way they are just because. They're the good guys. Tolkien's world is also complex, but you don't gotta fucking read the Silmarillion to fuck with elves. Fantasy invites the audience to take the elves just as they are. We aren't invited to have a scientific sense of inquisition, nor a political sense of cynicism when it comes to fucking Legolas and the boys, you know? How they shape their world and how the world shapes them is not a core part of their identity. The Fremen also shape their environment just as it shapes them. They store huge amounts of water for eventually triggering a rain cycle on Dune. And they admit that this goal, rain on Dune, is something that they won't see for many years, generations, but it is worth sacrificing their own safety right now for a chance of a better Dune in the future.
When we have enough, we shall change the face of Arrakis.
Other tamperers of the environment are the Bene Gesserit. In Dune's distant past, the Bene Gesserit spread their Missionaria Protectiva, ideas and prophecies amongst the Fremen. These prophecies point towards an off-planet messiah, born of a Bene Gesserit, leading them to victory. Many generations later, this initial spreading mutated into the Mahadi religion of the Fremen. Paul and Jessica show up to them and hey, here's an off-planet guy, born of a Bene Gesserit. You should really get all this stuff only we know about.
That it is.
He shall know your ways as if born to them.
In fantasy, the prophecy that calls for a hero is never called into question like this. Characters wonder if a prophecy will come true, and never who spread it or why. In Dune, we know who spread it. Scary witches! And Paul and Jessica know this too. They know it's fake, but they use it to gain power anyways. Paul's heroism and its effects are hugely important to Paul as a character and to Dune as a series. From the get-go, Paul feels infected with a terrible purpose, and this terrible purpose comes into full effect about a third of the way into the book when Paul and Jessica are hiding in the desert. And Paul starts to lose his mind. The trauma of fleeing, the knowledge of his father's death, the saturation of spice sends Paul on a trip. He sees the future, truly, for the first time. He sees himself becoming a hero of prophecy. And then he sees the end point of his heroism. He will become Emperor of the Universe, a Messiah. The Fremen will love him, and they will fight for him, whether he can stop it or not. An intergalactic jihad. Uncontrollable genocide in his name. A terrible purpose. That is the cost of Paul's heroism. The fantasy hero is an uncomplicated good. Paul being a hero will bring untold suffering to the universe. When Aragorn takes the throne in Lord of the Rings, we don't question his rule. We don't think of his reign having a capacity of violence. He's charismatic, he's a goodie, so we assume peace. But to assume peace in our world would be naive. And so to assume peace in Dune, just the same. Frank Herbert wanted Dune to criticize the charismatic leader.
What is the message? What is the statement that you're attempting to make here?
Don't trust leaders to always be right. I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well. I think that our society was formed on a distrust for government, and we seem to have lost that distrust of government. I kid around and I say that my favorite president in recent years has been Richard Nixon, because he taught us to distrust government.
So a lot of questions get brought to mind. How does the place around us influence us? How will influences in the past actually play out in the future? When people have control over their environment, what becomes real or fake anymore? Does truth even matter in the face of power? All of these questions focus on people and their environment, and that thinking of past events and future consequences is what makes Dune its own thing, its own entity, separate from the fantasy that it is crafted around. A fantasy, of course, can be complex. Jesus Christ, it gets complex. But the draw of a standard fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, is the characters. We know that the good guys will win. But the films get us to love the good guys and to hate the bad ones. It's compelling, it's great, but it's less complex. Dune doesn't have good guys. It has people and their environment, and that's all. These ideas are what make Dune enjoyable and important, what makes the story worth telling. Strip them from Dune, and what remains? Well, Part 2. Only I will remain. In my seat for the rest of this film, the absolute state of this. It's no secret that the production behind the scenes of Dune was a mess.
David is absolutely brilliant. He really is. He is a genius. He's a crackpot, but he's a genius.
The project ballooned as they began filming more and more scenes of this really fucking too complicated book. Since Lynch didn't have final cut privileges, the studio, Universal, got what they wanted. A 2-hour flick that could be shown more frequently in the theaters because it could boost initial ticket sales because they honestly didn't think this had legs. Lynch swore never to do a film without final cut privileges again. I wonder how his career's gone since. Oh, hi, the next film he did, Extreme Critical Darling Blue Velvet. How are you today? Herbert wrote about all the scenes that were filmed and then cut. The list is sizable, and a lot of important scenes are on the cutting room floor. Scenes that would have grounded the characters and made their relationships make more sense. But even if we did get more Chani or Duncan, I doubt it would have helped much. All of that would make the film a slightly less incoherent mess. Let's start with the good, though. The film looks fantastic. The Renaissance style of the castles, the ship interiors, and the quarters, they all look really cool. The Harkonnen planet of toxic industry as far as the eye can see. And that mouth thing, I love that mouth thing. I love that mouth. The pugs are kind of weird, but I love it. The weirdness is a treat, and it matches what Herbert visualized when writing Dune. Nowadays, Dune has this veneer of prestige, so there's this pressure to not have things too crazy. I like the look of Villeneuve's Dune a lot, actually, especially how hostile and dry the planet feels. But the minimalist leaning for the interiors and the spaceships in that film make it feel all a bit sanitized. Herbert envisaged some fucking wacky spaceships, and Lynch is all too happy to indulge his creativity and Herbert's. When it comes to visuals, at least. But even with this crazy architecture and the fucking space bugs, the problem of adaptation remains. How do you film a story like Dune, which gets all its context not from the here and now, but in these grand plans that factions are vying over for generations? You can't catch slow environmental change on a camera in a single moment. It's antithetical to what film is all about, here and now, time and light captured. What do you do to tell this story? Here's what David Lynch does. Nothing! Lynch tells Dune like a fantasy story. With uncomplicated good, uncomplicated bad, and a lot of things that are the way they are just because. The nuance is that David Lynch is really good at just because stories. Twin Peaks is a masterpiece because so much of the weirdness that happens will never get explained. It happens just because. The Red Room exists just because it does. We can learn more about the rules of this weirdness, but we'll never get a full scientific explanation. And that's a good thing, because the point of the absurdity in Twin Peaks is not in its conscious logic, but in its subconscious completeness. Lynch is really, really good at making a nonsense story feel like a revelation. It's hard to put into words, but if you have anything to blame, just blame fucking Mad Lad himself.
You remind me today of a small Mexican chihuahua.
Dune doesn't work as that kind of story. A heavily altered Dune could, though, and that's where the good stuff lies. Paul's visions and mysticism really gels with Lynch's vibe. Frank Herbert and David Lynch both love transcendental meditation, and Lynch's atmosphere in these scenes are top-notch. Standing without moving, the sleeper has awoken. This all feels great. The difference is that Herbert was concerned with what was in these visions. He used the fogginess of perception as a storytelling effect. Lynch enjoys fogginess in and of itself. Clearing away the fog and getting out what Herbert meant never happens in the film. There is a casting off of the ideas of Dune that is almost total in its rejection. You get the feeling that Lynch doesn't want to engage with some ideas at all, and so either drops them completely or butchers them beyond recognition. Take those poor, scary witches, the Bene Gesserit, for example. To illustrate my point, let's look at this short scene between the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohim and Jessica. They're having a short conversation and they're about to give Paul the Gom Jabbar test.
Jessica, you were told to bear only daughters to the Atreides. Jessica!
It meant so much to him.
You thought only of a duke's desire for a son? Desires don't come into this. An Atreides daughter could have been wed to a Harkonnen heir and sealed the breach.
Jesus, okay, let's pause there. Notice how much shit just happened? Gaius Helen just jumps into the room and just starts dumping the whole Bene Gesserit subplot within the first few seconds. In the book, the Reverend Mother is also disappointed that Jessica didn't have a daughter, and we learn this in the first scene, but there's some key differences. First, she thinks it. She doesn't just slam the door and say, "This is my character's motivations for this film." In the book, she just thinks, "Damn, why did she not have a daughter?" And we don't get an answer straight away, which leads to the second thing that's messed up. Mystery. The Bene Gesserit pull strings from the shadows. You don't get all the answers immediately in the book, so they retain this sense of mystery. This is what makes the Villeneuve Dune such a good adaptation in some areas. We don't know what characters are thinking, so we get a completely different experience of this story. It retains the mystery so well. In the film, here's what we've been doing for the past 90 generations. And thirdly is the complexity. We do get an answer as to why Reverend Mother Helen Gaius is so annoyed that Paul is a man. She doesn't think he can become the Kwisatz Haderach. That's an acceptable answer for us at this time. She doesn't think he can become this magic person she talks about. That sounds great. What we don't know is that she also wanted Paul to be a woman so that she could breed that woman with Fade Rathra, or fucking Sting in the movie, and produce what they planned to be the Kwisatz Haderach. We learn that later on, much later on. This is a complexity that's lost within the film because it's just dumped all out.
An Atreides daughter could have been wed to a Harkonnen heir and sealed the breach. We may lose both bloodlines now.
The book layers on new levels of information as it slowly progresses. The film either gives it to you all at once or it doesn't give it to you at all. In short, it doesn't make sense to talk about breeding with the Harkonnens when we haven't met a Harkonnen yet. We don't know what that means. Their story doesn't matter to Lynch, so it's unexplored and left out. This happens consistently during the film. You get the feeling that ideas weren't left out so as to tell a tighter story, but because the film doesn't want to play with them. Okay, I'm gonna do it. David Foster Wallace.
Yo, I brought chips and dip.
Dude, get in here.
Come on, man.
Oh. You didn't want to be part.
What happened to Lynch with Dune, and then now...
This is water!
Quote, Lynch is more like the bright child you sometimes see who's ingenious at structuring fantasies and gets totally immersed in them, but will let other kids take part in them only if he retains complete imaginative control over the game and its rules and apparatuses.
Oh shit, he got David Foster Wallace on.
This is why the second half of the film just falls apart. After Paul finds the Fremen, the terrible purpose that is so central to his character is just gone. It's gone. It fades away. Never brought up again. Paul becomes the leader of the Fremen. He rides a big fucking worm, charges them to victory, and that's all. No fear over a jihad, over uncontrollable violence, over innocent people losing their lives. It's just gone. The conflict for Paul in the second half of the book was never if he could win over the Fremen. It's if he should. The consequences of his heroism is the real draw of the story. If there's no consequences for Paul's victory, then there's no point in telling the story, because you've robbed it of everything interesting. This is why the rain on Dune is the final crysknife the film leaves in the heart of the book. It rains just because Paul wills it. Just because he is the Kwisatz Haderach, and just because it's a simple fantasy ending. There was no water before, now there's loads of it, sure look, be grand. It's a simple triumph. It's Aragorn. We won. Like, leave behind even the fact that rain on Dune, in the universe of the books, would be a disaster due to the sudden change of environment, or that Paul's powers are not omnipotent weather control. Frank Herbert said himself, Paul was a man playing God, not a god who could make it rain. This goes beyond book consistency or in-universe rules. It speaks to the soul of the book. Thematically, what does this mean? It means one great man can fix things. It means Paul is a god and is always right. It means that the environmental prepping of the Fremen was a waste of time. It means that no community can change their environment, only the great, the strong, the powerful. Dune wanted more of us. It wanted us to be critical of the charismatic leader. It wanted us to consider the world we live in and the environment that surrounds us. It wanted us to think about rain, to think about water, how lucky some of us are to have it, how brave others for lacking it. Dune is complex. And although the new film is better at capturing it than the Lynch film, there's still something that is missing from Dune. Quiet. Quiet is the thing missing from Dune. With Dune's prestige, it commands a high budget. Studios want to make it big and explosive. They want it to be Star Wars for adults. It looks like they're getting what they want. Denis Villeneuve cites Star Wars as a big inspiration for him, even becoming a filmmaker. I really like the new Dune. I think it will be a good series. I'm excited to see how they portray the rest of the books. But there's always going to be something missing in the big budget Dunes. The book does have a few action scenes, a warm ride or two, but the majority of Dune is two people talking in a room. It's Paul and Jessica thinking, looking across the vast desert. My favorite moments from Dune weren't the exciting ones or the characterful ones. It was the moments where I finished a chapter, I put the book down, and I just thought, a quiet Dune, one that captured that feeling, is what I want. One that lets the book breathe. Think about the times we live in. We have our own environmental story playing out around us. The real Dune is a story that deserves to be told today.
I'm a believer in the high energy life. I just say we have to shift from non-renewable energy to renewable energy, and we have to start taking the steps now. We really do have to start taking those steps now. This is what we're looking at. The federal government says we have 40 years, approximately, of fossil fuels. Now let's say that their figure is accurate, give or take 10 years. That is not a significant figure until you start looking at the depletion, until you start looking at what happens when you're halfway there, what happens to the price of the remaining fossil fuel. We have the latitude to do enormous changes in this society. We have the energy resources to make these changes. However, these are not simple changes I'm talking about.
No, they're not.
No, they're not really simple changes. We're just going to have to bite the bullet on some things and say this is going to cost us. I say frequently that I do not want to be put in the position, I refuse to be put in the position of having to tell my grandchildren, and I have grandchildren, I'm sorry, there's no more world for you. We used it all up.
And maybe we don't need millions of dollars to tell this story. Maybe we just need a book. I'll leave you with one last thing. Do you know where Herbert got the idea for Dune? The first idea, before all the others. It was when he was an investigative journalist, and he was studying dunes for an article, and about the grass that was being planted by the government to hold them in place. Because what he found magical, and what I do too, is this idea. The dunes move just like the waves on an ocean. They're the same thing, only slow. Thanks for watching.